For most of television history, TV didn't just look cheaper than cinema. It was designed to be that way. Lighting was flat so actors could hit their marks quickly. Music was functional. Editing was built for speed, not mood. Episodes were engineered to reset cleanly for syndication. That wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was an industrial one. Television was a production line. Cinema was where style, authorship, and risk were allowed to matter. So when cinematic thinking started leaking into network television, it didn't arrive as something called prestige. It arrived as friction, through shows that broke production rules, stretched budgets, confused executives, and didn't quite fit the system they were made inside. They weren't classics yet, they were experiments, shows where filmmakers were trying to force cinematic language into a medium that simply wasn't built to support it. And no title on the small screen represents that collision more clearly than Miami Vice. Picture television in the late 1970s. Cop shows were everywhere, and most of them ran on the same basic engine. Shows like Kojak, Starsky Hutch, The Streets of San Francisco, or Beretta were popular for a reason. They were clear, efficient, and easy to drop into. You could miss a week, tune in halfway through an episode, and still know exactly what was going on. A crime would be introduced, the investigation would move briskly, and by the end of the hour, everything snapped back into place. And look, I'm not knocking these shows. They're entertaining, and most importantly, they worked. But depth was never really the point. Characters didn't change much, emotions rarely lingered, and stylistically, everything was built to be functional rather than expressive. The formula kept things moving, but it also meant that most of these shows felt interchangeable. Eventually, that kind of reliability starts to feel stale. Something needed to change. And quietly, in the early 1980s, it did. Two shows in particular started pushing against those limits. Hill Street Blues on NBC and Cagney Lacey on CBS. These weren't radical in the way Miami Vice would later be, but they were disruptive in subtler ways. Hill Street Blues didn't just look different, it felt different. Handheld cameras, messier framing, more naturalistic lighting. It gave the impression that you were standing inside the precinct rather than watching it from a safe distance. More importantly, it stopped pretending that police work was clean or simple. Bureaucracy, politics, moral compromises, unfinished business. Cases didn't always resolve neatly, and characters carried emotional weight from episode to episode. That was a big shift. Cagney Lacey pushed from a different angle. By centering on two complex female detectives, the show introduced perspectives network television had largely ignored. These weren't side characters or love interests. They were professionals navigating sexism, personal lives, and the emotional cost of the job. The show asked viewers to sit with those tensions rather than gloss over them. Both series were critically praised. Both were talked about as important. And both struggled, at least initially, with ratings. They were ahead of the audience, or maybe more accurately, ahead of what network television was comfortable being at that time. Which brings us to NBC itself. In the early 1980s, the network was in trouble. Low ratings, weak identity, consistently losing out to its competitors. NBC didn't just need a hit, it needed a reset. That reset arrived in the form of Brandon Tartikoff. Tartikoff was only 32 when he took the reins, and he didn't play it safe. He greenlit shows that didn't look like guaranteed winners. Cheers, Family Ties, The Cosby Show. And crucially, he stood by Hill Street Blues even when the numbers didn't justify it. That willingness to back creative risk would matter. A lot. Because it created the conditions where a show like Miami Vice could exist. The origins of Miami Vice are one of those stories that get retold so often it starts to sound tidy. But the truth is, the show didn't come from a single clear idea. It came from a handful of half ideas colliding at the right moment. There are at least 3 competing origin stories, and honestly, the fact that all of them exist tells you a lot about what this show was. One version starts with Anthony Yerkovich, a writer on Hill Street Blues who became fascinated by asset forfeiture laws. The idea that police could seize money, cars, and property directly from drug dealers felt like a modern hook, not just in crime fighting, but crime as an economic system. Another version is the famous memo by Brandon Tartikoff that simply read MTV Cops, which sounds ridiculous on paper and kind of is. But it also gets at something important: rhythm, youth culture, music, image. Even if the final show doesn't literally resemble MTV, the instinct behind it is there. The third version involved the planned Hill Street Blues spin-off centered on offices Renko and Hill. That idea was dropped once executives realized they were 2 of the most popular characters on the show and probably shouldn't be removed from it. 3 different starting points, none of them fully explain what Miami Vice would become. That's because the real transformation happened when Michael Mann entered the picture. If Yerkovich brought the concept, Mann brought the worldview. The director didn't just tweak the show. He reimagined what a police series could look and feel like. The pastel color palette, famously inspired by a visit to a paint store, wasn't just cosmetic. It was a declaration. This was going to be a show where visuals carried meaning, where mood mattered as much as plot. Music was treated the same way. Instead of traditional TV scoring, Mann brought in Jan Hammer to create a synthesized sound that felt contemporary, emotional, and unmistakably modern. The music wasn't there to underline scenes. It was the scene half of the time. As production was starting to roll, casting remained an uncertainty. Mind you, this was still an era when film actors didn't rush into television. Names like Nick Nolte and Jeff Bridges were floated for Sonny Crockett. Denzel Washington was reportedly considered for Ricardo Tubbs. None of that came together. In the end, the show landed on Don Johnson, then a 34-year-old actor with a patchy at best track record, and Philip Michael Thomas, who was virtually unknown at the time. On paper, nothing yelled safe bet. And yet, on the 16th of September 1984, Miami Vice premiered and immediately felt unlike anything else on television. Not because it had a single, perfectly formed idea behind it, but because it was the product of ambition, risk, and a network briefly willing to let something strange through the door. When the show premiered, it made an immediate splash, and not in a subtle way. This didn't just look different from everything else on television. It looked like it came from a completely different medium. The colors, the fashion, the music, the pacing. It felt like television had suddenly borrowed cinematic language it wasn't supposed to have. People magazine famously called it the first show to look really new and different since color TV was invented, and honestly, that doesn't feel like hype when you watch it now. A lot of that impact came down to Sonny Crockett. Don Johnson didn't just play a cop. He became a cultural symbol almost overnight. Crockett was part maverick, part fashion icon, and unlike most TV detectives at the time, his image mattered. The pastel t-shirts under Armani jackets weren't just wardrobe choices. They were signaling a new kind of masculinity on television. Relaxed, stylish, slightly detached. And that black Ferrari Daytona Spider, even though it was actually a kit car built on a Corvette chassis, quickly became as recognizable as the character himself. But what made the show work, at least for me, was the contrast. Philip Michael Thomas's Ricardo Tubbs was the perfect counterweight to Crockett. Whereas Johnson's character embodied laid-back Miami cool, Tubbs brought New York intensity and emotional drive. He wasn't just there for balance. He had a clear motivation, hunting the man responsible for his brother's murder, and that gave the partnership real dramatic weight. Their chemistry never felt forced. It felt like 2 very different men learning how to operate in the same moral gray area. Around them, the supporting cast helped flesh out the world without stealing focus. Zito and Switek added levity, Gina and Trudy grounded the team emotionally, and the arrival of Edward James Olmos as Lieutenant Castillo introduced a stern, almost haunting presence that hinted at where the show would later go tonally. And despite all this talk about mood and style, Season 1 isn't empty. Far from it. The cases mostly orbit the drug trade, but they're tied together by ongoing personal pressures. Crockett's divorce, the pursuit of the Colombian drug lord Calderon, and the shadowy Lombard organization give the season a loose but noticeable through line. It's not fully serialized in the modern sense, but it refuses to reset completely. Consequences linger, emotions carry over, and that alone made it feel different from most network television at the time. The guest cast only reinforced that sense of ambition and variety. You've got Dennis Farina bringing real menace as Al Lombard, Pam Grier adding emotional complexity as Valerie Gordon, and early appearances from actors like Terry O'Quinn and Ed O'Neill. There's also a participation by a then unknown Bruce Willis, whose appearance as arms dealer Tony Amato tackled domestic violence in a way that felt unusually dark for network TV in 1984. And hovering over all of this was the music. Miami Vice wasn't just telling stories, it was staging them. The production spent upwards of $10,000 per episode on music rights, which was almost unheard of at the time. Jan Hammer's synthesizer themes became inseparable from the show's identity, whilst licensed tracks jumped from ZZ Top to Cyndi Lauper without ever feeling random. Even Glenn Frey's Smuggler's Blues didn't just appear in the show, it actually inspired an entire episode. This first season feels revolutionary, not because everything is perfectly balanced, but because you can sense the ambition in every frame. It's a show discovering what it can be, sometimes overshooting, sometimes stumbling, but never playing it safe. This first season settles into a loose but recognizable rhythm pretty quickly. Most episodes are built around standalone crime, but they're never just about the case. There's always something personal running underneath. Crockett's emotional detachment, Tubbs's grief and anger, the cultural clash between Miami's laid-back surface and New York's harder edge. You can feel the show playing around with how much character it can smuggle into what's still, technically, a procedural drama. There's also room for texture. Swidek and Zito always bring a bit of chaos and humor. Crockett and Gina's brief romance is introduced, quietly dropped, but not erased. It leaves a residue that carries forward. And that tension between vibe and violence, between glamour and consequence, is always there, in embryonic form. To offset some of the heavier material, the show leans on comic relief through recurring informants. Martin Ferrero's Easy Moreno is pure Miami chaos, a hustler, a schemer, occasionally useful, but most of the times unbearable. Charlie Barnett's Noogie Lamont plays a similar role, all flash and fast talk, embodying the city's street-level energy. These characters don't just lighten the tone, they help sell the world. Taken as a whole, Season 1 works less as a perfectly polished narrative and more as a sensory experience. Pastel colors, neon nights, designer suits, and music doing as much storytelling as the dialogue. It's stylish, yes, but it's also surprisingly interested in the psychological cost of undercover work. The stress, the isolation, the moral blur. And within that first season, a handful of episodes really lock everything into place. These are 5 of the episodes where, for me, Miami Vice starts feeling like itself. At number 5, we have Smuggler's Blues. This was when the show went internationally early. Crockett and Tubbs pose as smugglers and head to Cartagena to expose corruption inside law enforcement itself. It's tense, well-directed, and immediately memorable thanks to the opening needle drop of Lunatic Fringe. The episode is stylish, but there's real menace underneath it. The 4th episode on this list is Nobody Lives Forever. It's an episode that leans harder into the personal cost of the job. As the Vice Squad chases a group of violent criminals tearing through the city, Crockett's new relationship becomes a liability. It's a quieter episode, but a more emotionally grounded one. The mix of intimacy and danger works beautifully, especially set to Red 7's Heartbeat, which director Michael Mann would later reuse in Manhunter. Following up at number 3, we have One-Eye Jack. This is an episode that marked the arrival of Lieutenant Castillo and changed the energy of the show almost immediately. Crockett is framed, old relationships resurface, and the moral ground starts to shift. Wonderful Tonight by Eric Clapton playing during the boat scene shouldn't work, but it absolutely does. This is a perfect showcase of a TV series learning how to weaponize mood. At number 2, we have Brother's Keeper. Still one of the strongest pilots television has ever produced. It introduces the entire squad, establishes the tone, and gives Tubbs a clear emotional engine through his brother's murder. The iconic sequence set to Phil Collins's In the Air Tonight is nothing less of one of the most perfect moments in television history. And you don't just understand the show by the end of the episode, you feel it. And topping this list is Calderon's return. This is where, in my opinion, Miami Vice fully becomes Miami Vice. As a direct continuation of the pilot, it raises the stakes across the board. Crockett's divorce is resolved. The Calderon arc comes to a close, at least for the time being, and the show delivers its first genuinely devastating character moment. It's an episode that balances humor, violence, and psychological weight in a way the first episodes only hinted at. Even the slightly botched opening theme mix adds to its odd transitional quality. The scene in which Crockett rushes to rescue his wife, set against In the Night by Russ Ballard, feels like the end of one chapter, at the beginning of something different and more confident. So that's season 1 of Miami Vice. Not a perfectly polished masterpiece, but something far more interesting. A show discovering what it could be in real time. You can see the ambition in every episode. Sometimes it hits, sometimes it misses, but it never feels cautious, and it never feels interchangeable. This first season doesn't just introduce a style, but rather introduced a way of thinking about television. It represents a moment when the small screen briefly stopped behaving like TV and started behaving like cinema. In the next episode, we'll look at what happened when the experiment suddenly has real momentum behind it. Because once Miami Vice works out what it is, the question becomes how far it can push it.